Welcome to Deep Look, Ultiworld's weekly radio show about the current state of Ultimate. I'm the host and the editor of Ultiworld, Charlie Eisenhood. Joining me is Ultiworld senior editor Keith Raynor. Keith, is there anything for us to talk about this week on the show?
No, it's just another one of those quiet weekends in Ultimate. It's we're pretty used to it. So Charlie and I are going to do our top 10 backhands that we've ever seen. So that's today's show.
Well, actually, that would be a pretty good concept for a segment, or rank players by the who are the top 10 forehand throwers in Ultimate.
I will say I do
probably get more clicks than the episode we're about to do.
Two thoughts on this. One, I do like Riot hasn't done this in a while, but they used to do this thing where they would put out a graphic where it was the silhouettes of their players throwing, and you had to try and guess which player it was.
Guess the Pokemon.
Yeah, and I actually really enjoy that because I feel pretty good about my ability to look at people's form and know which player it is. I certainly, with players I coach, I feel like I could easily do that. Second, about this, the AUDL tweeted about the hypothetical AUDL video game. I'm thinking this was just to generate buzz. This is not where they're at in the process of the game, but they were tweeting about who would be the highest rated throwers in power, and that started some conversation. So it's kind of similar to this, thinking about who are literally the highest power throwers in the league. It's me. I love a good fun hypothetical.
Well, we'll put it down for an actual slow week, which is
we have an actual busy week.
We do, Keith. We do. We are going to be talking PUL. We had the two first championship weekends, one in New York, one in Portland, Maine. And so 6 PUL teams in action for 2 kind of mini round robin tournaments and then a championship game. And then big news from out at SFI West, where a player on Dallas Public Enemy vaccinated tested positive for COVID-19 on Saturday morning of the tournament. And there has been a great deal of conversation about what happened next, and we will get into that in a little bit. First up, let's talk some PUL. In the East tournament, the Raleigh Radiance come away the champions. They beat DC Shadow 20-18 in a really a bounce back win for them. And they lost to DC pretty handily on Saturday, but really picked things up on the offensive side of the disc on Sunday and end up winning the tournament in a very exciting final. And up in Portland, it was a win for Revolution, 20-14 over the Austin Torch. And so Medellin Revolution, no surprise there. Revo Pro, I should say, looking like the best team. And they actually won the final without Elizabeth Mosquera, who very unfortunately appears to have torn her ACL in the first game of the weekend. And, really unfortunate to see another soft tissue injury. But Revo does get the win. And so, Keith, I know you were there calling the games for the East tournament. And, we got to see a new team on the field for the first time in DC. And we got to see some amazing plays. What did you think of the action this weekend?
It was exciting. I think we were all very shocked by DC coming out and just walloping these two teams that I think were pretty confidently, we would say, were the number 2 and number 3 teams in 2019. You posed, Charlie, and time to revisit this. Maybe Aiden, our producer Aiden, can replay the clip. But Charlie was posing the question: is New York Gridlock, are they better than Medellin? But it's not a great take now. It's a
freezing cold take.
Yeah, they did not have a ideal weekend, the host team. Although, to be fair, they only missed out on making the final by a single goal.
But
embarrassing goal. But
it was not a good look. They played bad, Keith. They just straight up played bad. I think so the roster is very legit. I think that given, if you kind of went back to basics and you refigured out the O&D lines and you figured out the strategy, I do think it could be the best team in the league, but it certainly didn't look like anything like it. I think I also put too much stock in the Portland scrimmage. Portland goes 0-2. I don't think I should have put much stock in that game at all. And New York looked quite good in that game, I thought.
I think we also got a little trapped by like maybe we overestimated Portland too. I mean, they looked pretty good on paper. So like all together, when you tie it together, it's like not it's a struggle. But DC looked, they had a clear game plan, which I think was a really important part of getting them through some of the initial jitters that might come with playing in a new format in a new environment with a new roster. But they leaned on the talent. I will say, I think Daniel Prentice was trying to make the argument that they were still, that like in some ways they still won. They had the best point differential. When they played the best, they looked like that their ceiling was above where other teams were. So even though they lost to Raleigh in a close Sunday final, in some ways they won. I'm not on that. You got to win the games that matter. They knew just as well as anybody else that Sunday game mattered. But I'm a little curious about their long term. Like, what does this mean for the Shadow moving forward? For a second there, I joked that they were like one of the most successful franchises in pro history. They come out and they blow everybody out in good teams. But like, they got a lot, and I mean a lot of production from the trio of Erica Bacon, Sarah Meckstroth, and Claire Trope.
They did. I'm
not sure that we can necessarily count on those being players on the roster in 2022 because they were not announced as part of the team in 2020 when they didn't get to have a season. And then this 1 weekend tournament format is pretty forgiving as far as taking on new players to your roster. So
right.
That may not be sustainable because I think without those players they would have had trouble having anything close to the type of success that we saw them have in Bayonne.
I mean, I don't think we can really try to hypothetical out, who's going to be where. I mean, Claire Trope's living in DC right now, so why not? Why won't she be on Shadow? Erica Bacon is living in Pittsburgh, so there's not an obvious pro team for her to play on. By the way, Erica Bacon and Sarah Meckstroth, right? Like, not that we haven't already had this conversation a bunch of times, but anybody who questions whether they can like be elite players in the women's division, the question is answered. I mean, they were like two of the best players of the entire weekend. They looked amazing out there.
Bacon's performance in a losing effort in the final was maybe the best I've ever seen her play.
Crazy good. I'm excited. I mean, she's playing for Parcha, who we're going to get our first look at this weekend at the Elite Select Challenge, this new Pittsburgh team. I'm excited to see what that team looks like because seriously, Erica Bacon was balling out. We're talking about somebody who was, had an unbelievable season in, was it 2018?
2019, I think, second runner-up player of the year in mixed division.
Was it 2019? I guess it was. Yeah. It was. She had an incredible regular season. Didn't play quite as well at nationals, but awesome stuff from her. And I think it's really fun about the PUL, and really this is you should go for sort of semi-pro ultimate in general, is that you really get the best players all concentrated from like not even just a city, but like a regional area onto one team, and you get to watch like the best players competing. And in club, people splinter out. There's multiple divisions. Every city has its own teams. And not that that's bad. I mean, I think it's good in some ways. Like, you want to have that identity from different places, but these more conglomerated all-star type rosters make for really exciting ultimate. And it's not, I mean, there were clunky moments. There were some bad games. I mean, Raleigh, New York was a pretty ugly game, but you also had insane levels of plays. Like, the literal highlights were crazy.
Yeah.
And so as those trickle out onto the internet over the next, few weeks, keep an eye, because I mean, that's what it's all about. Like, this was a great spectacle, and that's the point, right? This is spectator focused ultimate.
I also think there's something to be said for the format as far as, we haven't talked much about what led to Raleigh's success. And I think a big part of that was the coaching and the implementation of their adjustments from Saturday to Sunday. You lose to DC by, 10, 11 goals or whatever on Saturday, and then come out Sunday and beat them. That wasn't an accident. Head coach David Allison looked like they made some key adjustments. They had a chance to kind of study up on their opponent. And that's something that is a lot harder to come by in club because you play 6 opponents. So how are you going to invest a bunch of time in understanding one opponent when, there's so much other edge to be gained by focusing internally on your own systems because those are applicable across all your games. But in this format,
keep in mind that the strategy of club is a lot simpler.
Yeah.
Because there's no clock. Or there's marginal clock. It's really just score points and identify that scoring that first point into, in and out of half can tend to be pretty important from a psychological perspective. In the semi-pro scene, you have to manage end of quarter possessions and time management and thinking about, what defense do we run? Do we want to burn clock or do we want to save clock?
We saw a lot of struggling with that in my opinion this past weekend, which is understandable. Not a lot of reps to get to practice this stuff. So I think that's something I felt like coaches were getting better at. We also saw them experimenting more with the timeouts. Like, I can use the timeout to reset the stall count. I can use the timeout to sub in my O line or get a big break opportunity or whatnot. Like, how do I decide when to do that? I think that's something that we saw coaches toying around with. I think it's something that I'd love to see more of. And a longer season is going to generate more opportunities for like exploration of that space. In fact, here's a tease. I think in the subscriber bonus, we should talk about what kind of strategies we're seeing. We've been talking in the AUDL about the onside kick as the Empire like to use. That we've seen the rollers and the trap sideline double teams. Like, what strategies are unlocked by Pro Ultimates rule sets that are not available in the traditional clublet and college game?
Well, you can sign up to listen at ultiworld.com/subscribe. It's less than $4 a month to hear not only the Deep Look subscriber bonus segments, but getting access to tons of other subscriber exclusives, newsletters, other podcasts, and more. So check it out.
Our bets column.
Oh, yes. And you're raking right now if you're tailing me, folks.
Very, very profitable to just bet with Charlie.
You're making it back your entire subscription in 1 week right now if you're following our Bets Perspective column.
It's a pretty good pitch, by the way. Pretty good pitch. I think Raleigh's coaching and the adjustments were a big part of their success, but also something that we get in this environment that we don't get in a traditional USA Ultimate competition.
I really wish we could see Raleigh and Revo face off.
Me too.
Revo was just outmatching the teams that they played. Let's be honest. Like, Portland and Austin, they're fine. They're good, but they're just not on the level with Revo in my mind. And it would have been fun to see Revo take on that East tournament. And I know that's not really possible or realistic to expect that to happen given the travel costs and everything else. But this is a problem the league is going to have to figure out. Like, Revo can't just stay in the United States for the whole season. So how are you going to manage that? Like, it's really, there's a reason other sports leagues don't have foreign teams besides, Canadian teams in their leagues. It's just like a crazy logistical nightmare. So I don't know what that's going to mean for the long term, but certainly awesome to see Revo out competing again. And speaking of Revo, Valeria Cardenas is playing for Molly this year, just announced. Molly Brown picking up Valeria, so she'll be playing alongside Manu, her sister, for Molly Brown. And I posed this question in the UltiWorld subscriber Discord, Keith. Does this make Molly Brown a title contender?
I think so. I think they're certainly in contender category, but I'm not even sure that it moves them into another tier or ahead of another team in title contender status. Like, that part is less clear to me. I think I commented in the Discord, like, we've seen Molly Brown do less with more. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's true. I as you know, Keith, I'm very high on Valeria's game. I think that she's going to bring a level of offensive dynamism to the team that could help unlock some things. Would it be crazy to see Claire play D this year? I feel like it can happen because it's like we'll let Valeria have the center handler keys to the O-line, and Claire plays D, where she's an incredibly talented player, and then gives them crazy pop after the turnover.
Depends on how much you cross her over. Like I think it would be a mistake to limit her touches in that way.
Good point.
But I imagine also, given her experience playing with the Cardenas sisters, that like there's a lot of extra edge to be getting.
I mean, you could just have them on the field together. O-line.
But I remember when we said the same things about her playing with Opie Payne, and Lisa Picathely. But I'm not saying that Molly can't do it. I'm just saying that I'm going to need to see it. They've burned us too many times.
I mean, they've had crazy talented rosters in the past that have not been able to get past semis. I mean, that's just a fact. That's just a fact.
Lost in quarters last year, Charlie. Not that last year's roster was as talented as some of the peaks, but they just got a long way to go and tough competition along the way.
Well, any other thoughts on the PUL? We're going to talk to Lindsay Soo from the Raleigh Radiance in just a moment. But before we get to that, any final thoughts on the weekend?
Great celebratory weekend. I'm looking forward to what the Central has to offer. I do wish we could get like some sort of conclusive championship. I'm curious. You know me, I'm a big like data nerd, like keeping a track of the narrative. Like, is this stuff going to count? Like, does this count towards your career stats? Does this count towards your franchise record? I don't know the answer to that. So it's kind of a weird bubble season. Is this a season? Is this the 2021 season? I don't know. So I have questions about that kind of stuff. But no, I think that there was a lot of great, exciting Ultimate. I'm definitely looking forward to the highlights and the Central stuff. And I think maybe a further conversation. This is an interesting idea you're bringing up. Is the cost of having Revo Pro in the league worth it? Like in the long run, at what point do they have to say like, okay, our product is exciting enough that we don't have to import talent?
Interesting thing to think about. All right, coming up, Lindsay Soo from the East champion Raleigh Radiance with us on Deep Look. We'll be right back. Joining us now on Deep Look is 2019 Premier Ultimate League Playoffs MVP and now 2021 PUL East champion Lindsay Soo. Lindsay, welcome back to the program.
Thanks for having me, y'all.
So this was an interesting, this was not a season. This was a little mini tournament with three really good teams. I think I can very confidently say that after watching all the action this weekend. How would you compare this experience and winning this to the first season in 2019?
Obviously, there's a lot of difference here. We have been working really hard in the off season, just like we were working hard in the 2019 season, but we really had no idea what it was going to look like. I think it was great in the 2019 season. Having the one-off games is one of the best parts about playing pro. I think, you get a week and then you get to kind of show off your stuff, give it all you got, and then you get to go back and regroup. But this year we were kind of working blind. We really didn't know what to expect from these teams who had awesome rosters and ended up being great teams, but we were just kind of doing our best to sharpen up as much as we could, but it felt like we had no idea what it was going to end up looking like. And fortunately it ended up pretty well for us, but it was definitely a very different experience from the 2019 season.
In fact, from like the league standpoint, you're usually playing these single game scenarios. Then, obviously you've played lots of club in college where you're playing 7 games in a weekend. Like, did this tournament feel more like what you're used to with club and college, or more like the PUL game, or just something totally different altogether?
It was definitely a hybrid because obviously not one-off games, but it was somewhat similar to the championship weekend of, the 2019 season. Because, in that you had your semifinal and then final. But playing the 2 games back to back, definitely much more like club or college. And that was tough. That was definitely something that was a struggle for us to work through. It was really hot. It was really humid. We were on the turf all day. And that's just like baking you from underneath. But it also, there's still those aspects that are way different from club or college. that I think played in our favor in a way of the timing of the games and the strategy of, having to play the clock rather than just to a certain point total and using those timeouts to our advantage.
DC beat you pretty handily on Saturday before you come back and beat them in kind of a back and forth battle in the final on Sunday. What do you see as the biggest difference between those two games, and what made it possible for the Radiance to come out on top on when it counted?
The biggest difference was our O-line for sure. We on Saturday were just not connecting at all. We were just having really, really silly mistakes. We were dropping it. The disc was like slipping out of our hands weird. We were throwing it behind people, and it was just that the DC D-line was punishing us for every single one of those mistakes. And so once we were able to get a control over those little things, then we definitely had a much more successful time. And, I had a feeling that I was really frustrated in that first game because it was little things that I felt like were so fixable that we were just not getting. And I think part of that is that, we had a relatively new squad. The O-line had never played together fully before this tournament. And so there were a lot of jitters. Tyler Smith, Karen Earhart, both new entirely to the pro game, as well as to the team. And so there was definitely a little bit of, growing pains through that first half, especially the first half of that first game, and then throughout the tournament. But we definitely got a handle on it on Sunday.
Were you surprised by how DC started off the weekend? You and New York are these two premier programs in the league. You both make it to championship weekend. You play this incredible semifinal last year. Everybody's kind of looking at the Radiance and Gridlock as these powerhouses, and then this brand new team that nobody's ever seen before comes out and runs teams off of the turf. Were you surprised by how good they were?
I was surprised. I actually anticipated New York being kind of coming on top of DC going into this. Just looking at their roster and their experience and their coaching, it definitely makes a difference to have experience in the pro game versus not. So I was really surprised how well they did, but also not because, if you just look at the roster, that is a stacked team. Those are some really incredible players. Claire Trope was just on fire the entire time. Even after she injured her hand in our game, she was still one of the best players on the field. And it was incredible, as well as Sarah Meckstroth and Erica Bacon were just, those are world-class players. So in a way you're surprised because of the format, but it's not altogether surprising given the talent that they have. But I did talk to some of the DC folks after the game, and I think they were a little surprised themselves that they had done so well because they also did not have practice with their full team ahead of the tournament. So they were kind of using this as to see where they would end up as well.
Well, you just named some DC players. I'm curious, who would be some players just across the tournament, your team, New York, DC, that you were most impressed by this weekend?
So definitely Claire Trope, like I mentioned, she was crushing it. Erica Bacon, I knew was a great handler, a great offensive player. I didn't realize how dominant she would be on defense, and she ended up playing a ton for them in the second half of our game on Sunday, and she was a huge impact player. From New York, I think that we had Amy Jo, who's always a really great player, and she was great for them. Lindsay McKenna was doing a good job. Lindsay McKenna was guarding me for most of the New York game and gave me a little bit of trouble and almost hand blocked me on the last point of the game, which would have been probably could have easily given the game over to them in overtime. So she was really incredible as well. But there are definitely tons of talent in both of those teams.
I want to talk actually about that New York game. You go into overtime again against New York. It's the nightcap. You're on the road. This is basically the only road game you're going to play because you're playing against the host team. You go into this OT. What is the conversation like on the team? And then you have this incredible zone point that it seems like the team continues to talk about. What was it like watching all that take place?
I mean, that zone point was incredible. The North Carolina women's teams are not necessarily known for being great at zone defense. We don't have a lot of wind in the summer, so there's not a lot of practice for us to be able to do it. And we really connected there. And so I was just like mesmerized. It reminded me of the game between Stanford and Dartmouth in the 2018 college semifinals, like where it was just, there was like 10 minutes and like 200 throws by Dartmouth against the Stanford zone. And, you know, they ended up completing that point. But fortunately for us, we had the clock run down. And so we were able to stall them long enough for it to not work. But I think, you know, one thing that David Allison, who was our coach, told us was, you know, this is a step along the way to what we want to be. Obviously, this is the kind of the culmination for our season in 2021, but everything that we were doing here is also for 2022 because it's not a full season. And so we were really focused on, you know, staying together, working through our systems and trying to, you know, whatever we did, we wanted to do as a team. We weren't going to rely on any one person. We weren't going to rely on any like individual plays, but we wanted to work through what we think will be our long-term success in order to get there. And it ended up working in the short term, and we hope that it'll help us in the long term as well.
I know you were involved in return to play discussions at the PUL leadership level. I know we're not done with these events. We have Milwaukee in a week and a half, and the three teams out in the Midwest. But how would you assess the, you know, success of this format, this return to play approach now that we've had these 2 weekends in New York and Portland?
It's hard to say entirely. I definitely had my head in our tournament as a player. I was really focused on that. So I haven't looked at all of like the numbers and like the social media engagement. It felt pretty successful, especially since our tournament was really competitive and the games were really close for the most part. It felt like that was a really good, you know, way to come back. Obviously, we would have liked to have a regular season. We would like to have, you know, a real championship narrative, but for, you know, lots of various reasons, that is just not the way that it's come out this year. And I think that's okay. I don't think I would rather us have, you know, these tournaments in the way that we've had them and do them as successfully as possible than try to stretch ourselves too much and have to go through some sort of season that ends up being subpar.
You mentioned the kind of looking forward from this position into 2022. And obviously you were on a big part of the 2019 team. How much continuity does it feel like there is as an organization from 2019 into now? And then looking forward, how do you keep this from being an isolated event and building in that continuity into your thought processes?
So 2019 was very different than 2021 for a lot of reasons. Not only do we have a new coach and a lot of new players, we also have a new leadership structure. We have in 2019, we were, it kind of felt like we were just doing whatever we could to keep up. And we were kind of like grasping at straws just to make sure the team was staying together. And now we have a steering committee and we have a plan for the future as a team. And I think that that's really important from the kind of off-field organizational side of things. And now we have a new coach, and he has been like, he's very invested. And we actually have multiple new coaches. DA or David Allison is our head coach, and we have Ellen Laviolette and Beth Gifford as assistant coaches. And but they're very invested, and I think have already started planning for future seasons. And there is like longevity built in there. Everything that we do is not just for the current moment, but it's thinking about the future as well. And he has future championships on his mind. And so having that kind of commitment is really awesome to see from a player perspective, because we don't have to worry about, like after the season, are we going to have to think about bringing new people in? Are we going to have to think about restructuring how we're going to be on the field? But we know that there's that like runway is built for us and is going to continue to be there so that we can continue to grow and move forward.
In your mind, in your ideal world, what do you want your ultimate season to look like? Do you think that this hybrid, we have kind of like spring, early summer PUL season, at least that's what we had in 2019, and then kind of club season in the late summer and then the fall. Is that what you'd like to see? Would you like to see this trend more towards the single game format, this pro format, as the primary mode of play? Do you think the club is here to stay forever? I'm curious for, how you see it as a high level player.
That's a great question. In an ideal world, I absolutely love the pro format. I love the single game format. I think that it's both best for visibility. I think it's best for like the health of players. I think it's really interesting for storylines, for like being able to follow along, even more so than tournaments, because everything's so packed in with tournaments. It's like it's easy to miss things because there's so many going on at once. So I absolutely love the pro format. I think that it's very, very difficult though. Even the AUDL, who has been around a lot longer than us, like it has trouble with it, and they've, only made so much progress. But, I think that this is really a great method to go towards. I don't necessarily, there's some tweaks with the rules and things like that, but that's kind of a separate conversation that we could make to make it like the ideal version of Ultimate. But I do love the format. I don't think that club is going anywhere anytime soon. I don't want it to. I love club too, but I would love to see more separation between club and pro. I think that if there was a way to have 2 separate seasons, that would be the better way to handle this, because it is a lot to go from, to have to fit in both, your travel for club and pro, or like hosting home games and things like that, and then also having to go to a tournament where you're playing 7 games in a weekend. I think it would be ideal if we could have, fully separated seasons rather than like that big chunking overlap in the middle, which is happening even more so this year because of COVID and having to kind of reschedule things and push it closer together.
And that overlap is a potential barrier to what I know I want to see, which is a championship cup. I want to see Raleigh taking on Managine, and whoever wins the Central. Is there any chance we could see that? Would you want it? Would you want that game?
I mean, of course. We already someone tweeted from our account like trying to see if Medellin would want to, stop by Raleigh on their way home to just play us after they had a great weekend as well. Especially since, we lost them twice in 2019. We would love to get a rematch against them. And we're really proud of our squad this year, and we think that would be a great game. But, it might not be in the cards this year. And I'm trying not to focus too much on what we can't accomplish this year and the good that's come out of this year instead, because I know that, if things keep going the way that they are, then we're going to be able to have it in the future. And, I can wait for that as well. I can wait for my 2022 championship.
Well, so what are you most excited for looking ahead to PUL next season?
I'm excited to have home games again. That would be great. I was really hoping that Raleigh would be able to host something for the 2021 season, but they're with trying to be equitable and spreading out the where things are. It didn't happen, and that's fine. But it's so great to have a home crowd and to have people cheering for you. There were not very many Raleigh fans in New York. There were some. Tyler Smith's parents were there, which was awesome, and they were cheering us on. But it's really awesome to have that feeling of your city backing you, and that's part of what Raleigh is doing right now, is really trying to build up the team in the context of the city as well, and make it a thing that everyone in that community can care about and root for. And so that will be something that I'm really looking forward to in 2022.
Awesome. Well, congratulations again on the win this weekend, and looking forward to seeing you back out there for the Phoenix season.
Oh yeah, very excited.
Are you going to Pro Champs?
We are going to Pro Champs.
All right. Well, looking forward to that. We'll see you there.
Awesome. Thanks, y'all.
Lindsay Soo with us here on Deep Look. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Deep Look. Great to chat with Lindsay. And I'm curious, Keith, for your thoughts on what Lindsay had to say about pro, the single game format, club, future of all that.
I've been pretty forward that I think the tournament format is primarily used as a cost-saving method. It is not optimal for performance, for safety, for spectators. We use it because it saves us money and it's convenient. It saves us time in some ways. There's a reason that basically this format is not used in almost any other high-level league format. So I don't see why there's a reason to defend it beyond once we get to the point where we can afford to do it. We can't do this for college and club because it would be too expensive. Teams would play 5 games a year or would only play against local competition. So it's not achievable there. And these league models are hoping to show that it can be done. So the money component to me is always going to be that limiting factor. And I don't even know, do we feel like we have full proof that you can do it? Is the AUDL profitable? These things are questions that I think some people might scoff at a little bit, but I think that it's clear that the single game format is a better viewing experience and probably a better playing experience than the 7 or 8 game 2-day format.
I still think that winning club nationals is like the pinnacle of the sport, but it doesn't feel like we're that far from it shifting. But you're right. I mean, the sustainability factor, the monetary factor of, is it possible to make this work long term and with enough cities to make it feel like it's a comprehensive league across the country? There's no Denver teams in any of these leagues. How can you have that, right? This is a city that's won multiple championships. So it's an interesting thought, and we'll save it for another show. Let's turn our attention to the West Coast and the Select Flight Invite West. Not normally a tournament that I think we would give a ton of time to here on Deep Look, but it's been all of the conversation online over the weekend because there was a positive COVID test for a Dallas Public Enemy player who was vaccinated, and then kind of the subsequent fallout from that and all of the decisions that happened and the things that played out. I'm going to try to give a quick summary here. There's literally a 3,500 word article about this up on the website that you can check out if you want the full details and all of the quotes. Basically, close contacts of the person who tested positive in the morning on Saturday after having tested negative, on Friday as part of a kind of like a normal routine testing procedure. Close contacts of that person were sort of initially isolated, and then USA Ultimate applied its policies in terms of who is allowed to play, who is not allowed to play, and what the what the decisions are. And it was decided unvaccinated players who'd had close contact had to immediately leave the facility and no longer participate in the tournament. People who were vaccinated who had close contact were allowed to continue to play with no further restrictions. Now, specifically, this is the guidance from the CDC. You can go look it up yourself. Center for Disease Control website says that, what do you do in an exposure? If you're vaccinated, monitor yourself for symptoms, get tested 3 to 5 days after your believed exposure, but you don't need to change your behavior. So this is what USA Ultimate's medical working group establishes the policy, and it's what was followed in this case. So then what's the big deal about all this? Well, teams were not contacted besides Public Enemy about the situation. And then, so the first big thing, the crossover game on Saturday afternoon, Mischief was set to play Public Enemy. Public Enemy approached Mischief and said, hey, we had a positive test. Here's the situation. Talk about like what's going on. Like Mischief has this conversation internally. You know, what should we do? Some people were really uncomfortable playing. Others were willing to play. Ultimately, after like an hour, Mischief said, you know, we just want to forfeit. I mean, it's a crossover seeding game. It doesn't really matter that much.
In a season where the rankings don't count.
Rankings don't count. Tournament results don't matter. So they go to USAU and the TD Grant Boyd, and they say, hey, you know, we just want to forfeit this game. We don't, you know, the team doesn't feel super comfortable playing against Public Enemy given the situation. And, you know, it's just Public Enemy's okay with it. We're going to call it a forfeit. And USAU said, you can't forfeit. If you forfeit this game, you forfeit the entire tournament. You're out of the tournament, and you could face future sanctions. Now, this is all part of the club guidelines that USA Ultimate has in place for forfeitures outside of the last round of consolation. So teams aren't just allowed to quit in the middle of a tournament without potentially facing consequences for that. And so, you know, ultimately Mischief said, well, okay, like we don't want to face future sanctions. We'll play the game. So they wore masks. Public Enemy wore masks, even though that wasn't required. They separated the sidelines and they played the game. No further issues there. Then it comes up again the next morning. Cutthroat out of Reno doesn't want to play the game. They're told that they could face consequences. So they show up with a skeleton crew and proceed to drop the PUL intentionally and side stack all the way to the sideline and just completely stay away from Public Enemy for 10 straight points. At which point, USAU folks come over and say, if you don't actually try, we're going to consider this a forfeit and you could face sanctions. So then they sort of like half-assedly play zone for the rest of the game, and it finishes like 12 or 13-2. Then it happens again in semis. Los Angeles Lotus doesn't want to play the game. Public Enemy is willing, like Public Enemy wants to play, but they understand that, you know, teams have just not wanted to play them. So they offer to forfeit, but they're told the same thing. If you forfeit, you could face sanctions. And so Lotus doesn't want to deal. They don't want to face sanctions. Public Enemy doesn't want to face sanctions. So they're like at this impasse. Eventually, Lotus says, "Fine, we'll just forfeit. We don't want to play the game." And after that, the Public Enemy team decided to withdraw from the event because it was clear that nobody was going to want to play them. The final didn't end up taking place because Lotus had already forfeited and Public Enemy had withdrawn from the tournament. So the Arizona Mixed Mischief game was sort of the other semifinal, kind of played as the de facto final of the tournament. This was reported on UltiWorld Live Twitter account, and there has been obviously an incredible amount of discussion. A lot of people very upset with USA Ultimate for the way that they handled the situation, and you know, a ton of questions about like what should the policy be? What about this forfeit policy? I think the thing that makes the most sense, Keith, is that right now we send it over to our interview with Megan Tormey, a captain of Public Enemy, who we have a bunch of questions for about how things played out this weekend. And when we come back from that interview, Keith and I will share our thoughts. So, Megan Tormey coming up next. Stay with us. Joining us now on Deep Look is Megan Tormey, who is both a known quantity as a color commentator in the sport, who's been doing commentary for years on AUDL and club games, and is also a captain of Dallas Public Enemy. And, well, Public Enemy is back in the news, Megan. First of all, welcome. How are you?
Thank you very much for having me. I am well. Thanks, Charlie. Good to be with you and Keith. So,
there's a lot to kind of unpack from this weekend out at SFI West. You had a player on your team who woke up Saturday morning at the hotel and experienced COVID symptoms despite having tested negative the day prior. gets a rapid test and tests positive that morning for COVID-19.
Yes.
And this set into play a string of events about, USAU making decisions about who was allowed to play and not play, dealing with close contacts, etc. So I think, there's a whole article up on UltiWorld that kind of outlines the situation from USAU's side, the teams, lots of folks quoted there. So I won't go through the entire thing there, but you were in the hotel room with the player who tested positive.
Yes.
Just to confirm, you are vaccinated, correct?
I am vaccinated, yes.
What went through your mind when, your roommate for this weekend wakes up and says, I can't smell something. What's happening in those initial stages before you even knew that there was going to be a positive COVID test?
Yeah. So I actually didn't speak with her. I had already left the room. And then one of my fellow teammates who was in the room too said, I don't want to alarm you, but she thinks she needs to go get a test. And I knew she had just tested because that's just a habit of hers. And so, obviously in my mind went two different possibilities, that it's possible she's testing positive, or what seemed far more likely to me was that she was just being overly cautious and it would be a negative test. And so I wasn't alarmed, but did think, okay, this is now something that's going to be in the back of my mind as we get ready for the games today.
How is your teammate doing? I feel like lost in this. Nobody has really addressed the fact that somebody in our community is potentially in danger. Is your teammate doing all right?
She is. Thank you very much for asking. She is still isolating in Southern California. She wasn't feeling very great on the very first day, but since then her symptoms have dissipated. And so she's just relaxing and spending a lot of quality time by herself in Southern California.
So when you found out that the test was positive, and this was early in the day on Saturday, you're personally affected because you're in the room with them, but you're also captain of the team.
Yeah.
What are you thinking at this point?
So my initial thought was just, we have to let so many people know. We have to let everyone know. And it was during halftime that she called me. And so I spoke with Adam Goff, our coach, and he was like, okay, I'll go tell the tournament director and set into motion what needs to happen through USAU. And Chris Plushik, one of the other captains or leadership of Public Enemy, ran over to tell the opposing team. And I called the whole team into a huddle and let everyone know the situation. And I said, I have to tell you, I don't know what to do. But thankfully, I do not have to make that decision. Adam is going to go find out from the experts what our next steps should be.
So at this point, you're kind of waiting to hear from USA Ultimate. Take us through what kind of happens next as you're engaging with USA Ultimate and figuring out what those next steps look like.
Their response was swift and was very assuring. They immediately found out who had any sort of contact with the affected player, so that they could determine what steps they wanted to take moving forward. So it was really nice to have their response be so fast, because it definitely felt like we were delegating to professionals as opposed to being left to make any sort of decision on our own. So that was really, really nice. The thing I was trying to do for the team was to just keep people mentally in the moment, because we didn't know what was going to happen. I didn't want people to mentally prepared to continue the game or mentally prepared to be done with the tournament, because we needed to be flexible in terms of going either way. So we were just trying to stay calm and present so that we could be ready for whatever steps were next. USAU's response was really reassuring, and it was really quick. Obviously, we had to extend halftime to figure out what to do, but it wasn't too long after that Adam came back and said the first step was to take everyone who had what was considered close contact with the affected player, in an enclosed space for more than 15 minutes, within 6 feet. Those players had to step aside and not participate in the second half of the game. So that was the initial step, right? That we were permitted to finish the game, but anyone who came into contact with the affected player was taken out of play immediately.
So ultimately, the decision was made that players on your team who were unvaccinated had to leave the complex and could no longer participate. But those of you that were vaccinated, even those who had close contact like yourself, were allowed to continue to play with no real restrictions. Just monitor yourself for symptoms, get tested in 3 to 5 days' time. Is that accurate?
A slight addendum to that. The unvaccinated players who had close contact had to leave.
Quite close contact. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
There was one remaining unvaccinated player who did not have close contact with the player, so that player was permitted to stay. But yes, to your point, the vaccinated players who had close contact were permitted to stay without restriction.
Since that included you, how did you feel about continuing to play?
So I was initially shocked, to be honest, just because I was sure that we would be done with the tournament, given the fact that we had someone who was in our hotel room and had tested positive for COVID. But when having known all that information and they said that we could continue to play, I was like, well, I guess they ran the numbers and it's safe enough for us to continue because, the vaccine has a really great efficacy rate. And I know that playing outdoors or doing any sort of outdoor activity, the rate of transmission is incredibly low. So I just figured that, those two things combined meant that it was not an elevated risk for opposing teams for us to continue.
To my understanding, given the transmission rates of outdoor distance activity versus indoor activity, the most pressing danger was probably presented to you and your teammates. How worried were you about your own personal safety and your teammates' safety, as opposed to, I know so much of the focus has been how Public Enemy's presence impacted the other teams in the tournament, but how did you address your own team's personal safety?
Yeah, so everyone wore masks around me and the other individual who was in the hotel room. And obviously we wore masks as well, simply because I knew that the information given to us from the medical committee was in regards to play. And I didn't want to run any additional risks for my teammates when we went indoors. So every meal I ate was outside and separated from other individuals. And then the other teammate who stayed in the hotel room with the positive case and I got a new hotel room and stayed together so that we didn't have indoor contact with our fellow teammates. The other individuals who had close contact, it was pretty much like just over the line in terms of what constitutes as close contact. It was a short car ride, and I believe they were all masked for some reason. And then I think indoors at dinner. So definitely constitutes as close contact, but wasn't sharing a hotel room for 8+ hours. Right.
There have been a lot of people online, I think more so just online as opposed to people at the tournament proper, who have criticized Public Enemy for not just withdrawing from the tournament. Do you feel that you should have done things differently? Ultimately, obviously, you did withdraw, kind of like after the Lotus team forfeited the semifinal, and you withdrew from the event at that point, and there was no final played. Do you think that you should have done things differently and just, erred on the side of caution and withdrawn from the event entirely as soon as you found out?
Yeah, so I've asked myself that question a great deal of times since the event, and I really struggle to think of a time where I would feel comfortable receiving information from experts and then saying thanks for your input I'm doing something else. Only because I know that if this is something we want to do, if we want to return to Ultimate, there are certain guidelines that we will all have to agree to. And, if we take that decision into our own hands, then do we ruin the chance for other teams to play a tournament that they do feel comfortable with? And obviously this was taken to the extreme. Like, teams did not feel comfortable playing with us, which is why we ultimately pulled out. But it was, it was pretty late that we made that decision, when it was very clear that games were just not going to happen. But in the moment, the reason that I felt like people were not comfortable playing with us was because they didn't have the full story. And so I think if I were to do anything differently, I would have reached out to all the teams, through the SFI group me, and given them the story. And the only reason that I didn't is because I didn't realize they didn't have the information. Like, I think the most salient example of that is when Cutthroat messaged us at 10 p.m. And unfortunately, one of my fellow captains, Chris Casey, was already asleep. And their message was basically like, "We heard there's a positive case on your team. Like, can we have more information?" And so we woke up and we're like, they don't know all of the details like that. That's really unfortunate. I would have a very hard time playing an opposing team if I had the amount of information that Cutthroat had. Like, I would have made a very similar decision if I knew as little as they did. So I don't know that I would have necessarily made a different decision about playing or not playing. But I definitely would have been far more proactive about reaching out to opposing teams. And again, the only reason that I didn't was because I thought they already knew.
It does seem like there's been a lot of friction and tension around the idea that you mentioned of, the experts say that this is okay, but what do we actually feel like is okay? So I think it's an important thing to acknowledge. What I also think, there's been this, as Charlie mentioned, this online reaction to the team. The team's been very transparent. You put out a statement on social media. Has there been frustration on the team or within the leadership about how the community has responded to this? Or do you feel like, it's mostly just an error of communication?
I would not say that there's any frustration. Something that I kept saying to the team in huddles when we were waiting to figure out if we were going to have an opponent was, there's absolutely no room for frustration or anger, because people are scared and we have no idea what is going on in their personal lives. For example, I have 2 children who are too young to get vaccinated. So in terms of what I do outside of Ultimate, it's incredibly limited, just because I want to eliminate as many risks as possible. So I completely understand. And the other point to think about in all of this is, when we had tryouts just a few months ago, things felt like they were trending so much more positively. And so there was a lot of questions that I didn't ask, like, am I really okay staying in a hotel room with a fellow vaccinated individual? Just because it seemed like such a surefire thing, or just like it would be such an incredible coincidence for there to be a problem. And with this recent surge, the confidence that I had is obviously a lot lower. So there's no frustration on the part of PE for how people have reacted. I think it's perfectly appropriate. I think that people have been raising a lot of really important questions. I also think people have been asking themselves a lot of really important questions. Leadership on Public Enemy being no different than that. We are talking through a lot of things right now. And if Ultimate is something that we want to try and play this year, if this is something that we want to do, we need to continue to be flexible and nimble, because the situation changes from day to day. So the confidence and the assurance that we had just a few months ago seems to be diminishing. So we need to change how we move forward in order to do this safely, if this is what we want to try and do.
The player that got COVID was vaccinated, but you do have unvaccinated players on your team. I'm sure there are many other Ultimate teams out there that face similar situation. How have you given this thought, like, about what you're going to do about that? Are you going to continue to allow unvaccinated players on the team? How did you come to the decision to feel comfortable letting unvaccinated players be on the team? I think a lot of people are dealing with these kinds of questions right now.
Yeah. So again, earlier in the season, the reason that we did not require vaccinations was because we thought we would achieve a high enough vaccination status on the team, and that things would trend more positively to the point where it wouldn't be as big of an issue. And we also felt like we came up with a fairly safe solution by requiring that unvaccinated players travel and lodge together and do not have contact with vaccinated players. And the interesting thing is we certainly thought that that was a measure that we were going to use to protect the vaccinated players from the unvaccinated players. But it worked out the other way around this time. If the unvaccinated players had followed the rules we set out more strictly, they would not have had to have left the complex. In terms of what we are going to do moving forward, that is also something that we are discussing. Simply because it's, if it's a reality that we might lose players at a tournament, this becomes a more costly measure to have unvaccinated players on the team. Even though in this situation it was a vaccinated player who tested positive for COVID.
What does the follow-up look like to everything that's going on? Have you been in communication with USA Ultimate and potentially their medical advisory board? What has the team been doing internally? I know you mentioned that there are a lot of questions that the team is addressing right now. What has that follow-up process looked like?
So we have not had any communication with USAU. The leadership and I have been discussing what we want to do in practices and also like travel planning and logistics in terms of tournaments moving forward. Like, do we need to have players travel at a similar time, stay in the same car, stay in the same hotel? So if there's a single case, it affects only, 4 or 5 people. So those are the kinds of questions we've been asking. We've also been wondering about whether or not we need to change practice protocols. And, one of the things that we did in the tournament was trusted the medical professionals. But we were completely willing to go above and beyond for our opposing team in the hope that it would make them more comfortable, like split sidelines and masking during play. And so we've been asking, do we want to go above and beyond in practice to make everyone feel safe? So those are some of the things we're discussing right now, is how to handle future travel and then how to conduct ourselves during practice in a way that will just make people feel more safe or just, eliminate any opportunity for any breakthrough cases to cause further spread within the team.
What did you think of USA Ultimate's decision to basically threaten potential sanctions on teams that decided to forfeit games against you?
So I want to be very cautious not to be overly critical. But to me, if the issue was failure to communicate to the opposing team on what the full situation was, I don't know how sanctions would be beneficial to fostering a feeling of safety or a sense of trust in how future tournaments are handled. When I communicated with Mischief, when I communicated with Cutthroat, it was clear they didn't have the full details, and whether or not that would have made a difference, I don't know. But I, personally speaking, if I knew that there was a positive case on an opposing team and knew that I was going to play them, I would be incredibly nervous. But if I knew that there was a medical committee that had made a specific ruling based on, data that they have access to and guidelines from the CDC, I would feel far more confident. So to me, it was like the not wanting to play Public Enemy was a cue for more communication as opposed to a trigger for sanctions.
So what do you see as kind of the next steps here? Do you feel like USA Ultimate should make changes to the procedures. I mean, there was already some discussion of that. I spoke with Billy Rodriguez, who sits on the medical advisory group, and he basically said that in a call this week, they're having a call with the medical advisory team for USAU, that he's going to advocate that any close contacts, whether vaccinated or unvaccinated, be removed from competition in the case of a positive COVID test. You know, whether that ends up being the consensus of the group, we will have to wait and see. Obviously, USA Ultimate's going to be talking about this all week, about how they should change or update the policies. You know, from your standpoint, I mean, you said you were shocked that you were going to be allowed to continue to play. Does that imply that you think that, you know, you shouldn't have been able to play and that should be a change that they make?
Well, I was shocked that we were permitted to play just because, you know, I operate with a similar fear to a lot of my opponents, but hearing a COVID case is incredibly scary. But I am not a medical expert. And so running the numbers and knowing the actual risk that this poses to other teams is not my job, is not my specialty. Which is why I was so thankful that we had access to individuals who are able to make those kinds of decisions. I think the best thing moving forward would be increased transparency on the way decisions are made. And also, if they do come to a consensus that individuals who have close contact but are vaccinated are dismissed, I'd love to know the reason for that as well. Because the reasons that I presumed were why we were permitted to play, why I was permitted to play, is simply because my risk of transmitting it is so incredibly low. And then the risk of me giving it to someone outside is so incredibly low that it was very safe for me to play. But if that's not the case, then that's something I'm very interested to know if that's the decision they make moving forward. But if anything, again, I'm just really thankful that these questions are being asked now so that we can, you know, it had definitely brought the issue to light for a lot of people, and will probably mean that we all operate a little more carefully moving forward, which means that we'll keep each other safer moving forward. So I'm glad that more eyes will be on the conversation that USAU has about what changes they want to make. And I think, again, that I would hope USAU responds by giving teams more information if there is a positive case during a tournament, so that everyone feels confident in their decision to be there. Because, you know, I, like a lot of people, did nothing during the pandemic, right? Like I said, I have 2 small kids. So we had outdoor play dates only, separated by a fence in our backyard. Like, we were incredibly cautious. And the fact that I'm playing Ultimate now felt like a safe and sound decision earlier, but obviously feels like far more of a risk than my family is willing to take right now. But if there's more transparency in these decisions, then we can proceed feeling far more confident in what we're trying to do.
What, just like as a final question here, what was playing at this tournament like? Like, did it just feel like you were constantly just dealing with the COVID questions versus like playing in an Ultimate tournament? Yes,
but that's okay. Like, if we're trying to play Ultimate in the middle of a pandemic, it's okay that people are asking these questions. I won't deny that it was a little disappointing we played Summer Days in Dallas a couple weekends ago, which isn't an incredibly competitive tournament. And so to be back at a competitive tournament felt like, I felt so fortunate, right, to have been able to be on the field. But we can't deny what's going on in the world around us. So it's definitely fine that that was the focus of the weekend, if that needed to be the focus. But yeah, obviously I was disappointed. My teammates were disappointed, but ultimately it's just Frisbee, and we wanted to proceed in a way that would keep our opponents safe. So it's hard to have the fallout be what it is. But again, I can't say anything other than I'm glad these questions are being asked.
It was going to happen to some team.
Right.
So, all right. Well, Megan, thank you so much for stopping by and being willing to chat about this. And obviously hope that everybody, you know, if anybody that has COVID recovers quickly, and that you all can get back out to a tournament again soon.
Thanks, Charlie. It was good to talk with you. Good to talk with Keith. So thanks so much for having me.
Megan Tormey with us here on Deep Look. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Deep Look. Thank you to Megan for coming on, being willing to come on and talk about the situation. And wow, I mean, I've had days to kind of like dwell on this and think about it. And I know you have too, Keith. You know, where do you fall on this I mean, I think there's a lot of different angles to approach it from. In terms of like the actual COVID policies that were in place, in terms of the communication side of things, in terms of the, pressure of potential sanctions on teams for not playing a game. I don't know where you want to start, but I'll just kick it over to you.
For me, there's really maybe 2.5 things that really come to mind here. And I talked a little about this during our interview with Megan, but there's a challenging position between the kind of distanced discussion of the potential risk you face when being in a situation like the one players were in at SFI West. Knowing that the opposing team had a player who has a positive COVID test, and that some of those players have, despite being vaccinated, have had close contact with that player and having to play against those players. We've talked a lot on the show about the risks of playing an outdoor sport with somebody and the transmission rates associated with those, or perhaps I should say the lack thereof, right? That in general, there's not a lot of evidence to support that there's a significant risk posed by transmission rates in outdoor sports. But understanding that at a distance is a lot different than being face-to-face with putting yourself in a position of risk. So I think that's one of the frictions that we come up against, and trying to find, what the appropriate line should be. If we had a really extreme example in this past weekend. We can have all the policies in place we want and all the data we want to support it to say, teams should play against Public Enemy and they can do so safely. So we can just continue the event. But if every team is like, I don't feel comfortable, whatever data you're showing me doesn't matter. It falls apart. So the policy in the community has to find some way to meet together in a way that makes people feel better about the situation, because when we walk away and everybody feels bad, USA Ultimate's probably not happy that the part of their event was derailed. Teams are not happy that they had to play and then didn't get to play. Is there anybody who's walked away like that? Yeah, I really feel like I had a satisfying weekend at SFI. You know what I mean? Like, nobody who's involved directly in this situation seems to feel good about the potential outcome. And a ton of credit to Public Enemy for the transparency that they've had. Even just talking with Megan today helps me feel more comfortable that they were making sound decisions and approaching this in the right way. And that kind of brings me to the other element that comes up to me, which is communication. This is something that we've dinged USA Ultimate for in the past plenty of times, maybe more than anything else. And it just feels like a lack of communication and transparency here caused so many more problems than there needed to be. And I get that for US Ultimate, it's the first time they're encountering this issue. And like they hit on 9 of 10 things, right? And so it stinks to be dinged for the one thing that maybe you didn't get right, or the two things or whatever. But how can you not walk away from this and think like, okay, there were some issues with the way that teams were being communicated with, that the community was being communicated with, because that has set in motion, I feel like, so much of the backlash and outrage online.
I cannot understand why it was not just immediately communicated to teams what was going on. Like I'm struggling to understand the decision-making process. And I talked to Will Deaver about this for almost an hour. And I think that USA Ultimate did a lot of things right.
Agreed.
I think that they quickly assessed the situation. They separated the players who had known close contacts, did the contact tracing process. They applied their policies. They checked with their medical working group that the policies were applied correctly. People who were unvaccinated that had close contacts were immediately kicked out of the tournament. And they said, following CDC guidance, following local guidance, these players who were vaccinated are allowed to continue to play. And if you disagree with the CDC, then okay, but like you need to have some data on your side to say why you disagree. Now, maybe it's we don't know enough about the Delta variant, so there should be a more strict policy, and vaccinated people who had close contact shouldn't have been allowed to play either. But we know vaccinated people are far, far less likely to contract the disease, even in the case of exposure to it. Number two, they're, from what we can understand, much less likely to transmit it if they do get the disease because they have lower levels of the virus in their system. And so when you combine these things on top of the fact that we play an outdoor sport where transmission rates are incredibly low compared to indoor situations, I do think that it is a logical position to say that people who were vaccinated don't have to, remove themselves from the tournament. And, I think some people want to see Public Enemy just completely kicked out of the tournament because they had a positive COVID case. I don't agree with that either, because I think it goes beyond sort of like the risk assessment, like a proper level of risk reduction. And it also creates a very strong incentive for teams to not report COVID cases because their team's going to get kicked out of the tournament. If you have a couple players get kicked out, that's one thing. But if the whole team's going to get kicked out, I feel like that really does change the incentives there. But coming back to the communication point, how does it make sense not to immediately contact the teams, at least in the mixed division, and say, we have had a positive COVID case reported from a player on Public Enemy. Here are the things that we are doing. We are following X, Y, and Z policies that were laid out in our return to play guidelines. Take a look if you want to see them. This is what we're doing. These people have to leave. These people are allowed to stay. We are recommending that, potentially you may choose to wear masks or do more things to make the game feel safer, and get feedback from the captains. And let people feel like they're a part of the conversation about how to feel good about continuing to play the tournament. And instead, that didn't happen at all. And it in complete opposite direction, the focus was on competitive fairness and setting a precedent by not allowing forfeits, despite people being uncomfortable about playing a team that had a known COVID positive, which, by the way, it's totally reasonable and probably in some ways likely that there were additional exposures within the team. These people practice together, they travel together. And yes, I know they went through the contact tracing process, but you don't exactly know what the timelines are like, and it all feels a little murky. So you may feel like, hey, there may be COVID positive people on this team, and I feel uncomfortable playing them. Why is the response, well, we're gonna punish you if you don't play this game? How is that the response? That just doesn't make any sense. I talked to Will about this, and he said, well, we can't say this team is safe to play and then allow teams to forfeit against them, which is basically us acknowledging that they aren't safe to play, and allow teams to kind of just push a team out of a tournament because of a COVID thing. People need to understand what the situation is. They've agreed to come to this tournament. We know that we're playing amidst COVID still circulating in the community. These situations may come up, and we can't just allow teams to kind of make their own rules. I get from a very removed, I'm all the way back over here perspective, I get that. You don't want to just let teams make their own rules in a general sense. But in this case, the first time that we're dealing with COVID at a tournament that we know about, to threaten punishment? to come over and tell the team that's like checking the box of playing the game, like, if you don't try harder, we're going to punish you? What? It just is crazy to me. I don't understand it at all. Like, who cares about the competitive fairness of the SFI West?
And does it even work? Like, if you're the team that, you know, is on the other side of the bracket that has to play a true matchup, a tough game, and the other team on the other side of the bracket is playing a team that's like purposefully being scored on by running a zone where they don't really try, like, even if that meets the bar of we tried in this game, does that actually have an impact on competitive fairness? Like, I don't even know if it helps it achieve the goal of competitive fairness at all. You can't make things competitively fair if the teams don't want to be, right? Like,
exactly.
You can't do it.
And it's not like these games got played anyway. The team still forfeited. And they were like, I guess, punish us. Which I'm sure they're not going to get punished. That would be crazy. I don't understand why this has to happen time and time again from USA Ultimate, of just like failing to do basic communication with teams and then having it become a big problem. It just has to stop happening. It has to. It has to stop. And like, it just doesn't feel right to have teams facing punishment because they're worried about getting COVID. Even if it's not rational. Even if it is safe to play Public Enemy. If it was me and I was on the other team and we were going to play Public Enemy, I'd be happy to play. I'm vaccinated. If I really feel uncomfortable, I'll wear a mask, but I know I'm outdoors. I logically understand that the risk is incredibly low, and I'm fine taking that risk. But some people aren't. So if teams want to forfeit because they're worried about the situation, I feel like there has to be a response besides, we're going to punish you if you don't play the game.
Is there a logical extreme here? I'm trying to think that could push your reasoning. Maybe if it's an individual and not a team, it's like, you know, we're in the national semifinals and Fury's playing Brute Squad, and Cammy Groom was didn't have a positive test, but was exposed to somebody who had a positive test, but it was the only person somehow. Like, it was not through Ultimate. And Fury was like, we're not going to play unless Cammy Groom doesn't play. You know, is that the logical extreme here? I don't know.
I do think you start to run into problems at those edge cases if you want to try to run it all the way out through the series. But I feel like you just have to cross that bridge when you get there and acknowledge that it's different when you're talking about a lot of teams coming out and playing their first tournament of the entire season out in California. And, you know, we're talking about California teams that have been very slow to return to play. And the first thing they do is they come back, and now they're facing a situation where they might have to play a team that has COVID exposures on it, and they don't want to do it. I think you should just say, okay, like, okay, you can forfeit this game and you lose the game. Like, it's not like the forfeiting team gets some kind of benefit. They still lose the game.
It was a wonky situation. I mean, that you start from a bad place, and it's tough to get back to a good one from there. And like you said, USAU did a lot of things I think we feel like were the right decision. But the tone that you interpret from the way that it sounds like people were being threatened with punishment, it's just not good. That part is leaves a bad taste in the mouth.
And I want to ask you, Keith, do you think that the policy should be different about who can play in a COVID positive test situation?
In some ways, yes. Like in the fact that, like, if it's not actually enactable, like if it's something that doesn't actually work in actual practice, like what is it really worth? But I also am like I'm not a medical expert. I don't have a lot of data on this information. And I feel like deferring to the medical advisory board is a perfectly reasonable approach. And so, you know, whatever meetings they have to revise their potential provisions, based on, new data or what they saw this weekend or stuff about the Delta variant. Like, I feel like I have to be willing to trust them. We say trust the science all the time when we're telling people like get vaccinated who feel like they can't, or even just to get people to wear a mask. Like, don't we kind of have to do the same thing and trust the science when the scientists tell us, yes, it's safe to play, even if we don't feel like we can play? Or is that hypocritical?
I mean, I think it's a really fair question. We're obviously still trying to figure out what's going on in terms of Delta variant and its effect on vaccinated people. I mean, I said this in the Discord, and I'm curious for your thoughts. I wouldn't really have a problem with USA Ultimate just coming out and saying, you have to be vaccinated to play at USAU sanctioned events, unless you have a medical exemption.
I also don't feel like I'd have a problem with that.
I kind of wonder whether something like that could happen. I mean, and obviously some people who are like unvaccinated and don't want to get vaccinated for whatever reason are going to be upset about it, but like, it's your organization. It's going to make the vast majority of people, the 95% or whatever amount of people who are vaccinated at these events, probably feel better about it. I mean, we can't deny the fact, though, that it was a vaccinated person who got COVID this weekend. I also think that teams need to maybe look a little internally and ask themselves, okay, we've now seen it happen. It was almost bound to happen. We're going to have a COVID positive test happen. There's going to be some kind of COVID exposure situation at a tournament. Are we willing to play a game in that spot? And if the answer is no, then I actually do think that, like, come the series, you should think about whether or not you're willing to play in the series. Because if you're not willing to play unless I mean, there's so much fog of war. I mean, that's not the right term to use here, but you get what I'm saying. Like, there's likely COVID exposures happening that we don't know about. And you have to be, I think, willing to take that risk if you want to go play in these events. I honestly wonder if Public Enemy's vaccinated players who had close contacts had been kicked out of the event as well, would that have made teams comfortable playing them? I kind of don't think so.
Yeah, I'm not sure that people are comfortable with the definition of close contact even.
Right. So
but partially we feel like that's because of irrational fears, that like the same thing that drives people to think that if you run by somebody in the park who has COVID, that they're likely to transmit it to you,
Yeah.
Well, at the risk of this being edited out of the episode, I mean, have you considered what would happen if we were at a nationals and one of the staff was like, you know what, I can't taste this morning. Like, what would we have to do? I don't really know the answer to that. Yeah.
I mean, we're going to be enforcing that everyone's vaccinated. Number one, what we would do in that exact circumstance where somebody like tested positive during the event, I honestly haven't given that a great deal of thought in terms of exactly what would play out. Like, would we have to remove ourselves from the tournament and stop reporting and like leave?
I'm pretty confident that you would sanction anybody who tried to back out. If somebody was like, I don't want to do commentary with this person who slept in the room with the person who was positive, you'd be like, well, you're going to face further sanctions.
I'm going to cancel your plane ticket home. But it's a good question. It's something that we actually have to have in place prior to going to nationals, I think. I don't know that it's an obvious thing. I mean, I would probably lean on the same thing that USAU has leaned on, which is follow the guidelines that have been put out there by the CDC. Not that the CDC has been perfect through all this, but like, you have to start somewhere with some kind of level of authority. And yeah, I think it's tricky.
I mean, maybe in the same way that we've said that every team needs to have somebody who's observer certified. Like right now, we need every team to have somebody who's a public health or virologist expert. Like Ultibucks strikes again.
Everyone's just scrambling to roster like doctors.
Just any doctor they could find. Be like,
Anybody.
well, look, you don't have to show up. We'll just pay your $90 fee. You're on the team.
To some extent, to be honest with you, Keith, when you ask me that question, it's like we have to acknowledge that even those of us who are vaccinated face some risk of infection because we now have endemic COVID-19 circulating in the community. Will we ever be in a world without COVID-19? Maybe not. So I think my feeling is probably where the CDC has landed, which is that it's like, if you're vaccinated, you continue to live your life and just, get tested if you know you've been exposed and monitor yourself for symptoms. And obviously, if you're feeling symptoms or you test positive, you need to isolate yourself and quarantine just like anybody else. Is that a perfect answer? Maybe not, but how else are we going to function at a tournament, let's say, without that kind of being the baseline expectation? Now, this all assumes that we're seeing efficacy rates remain high for vaccines, et cetera, et cetera.
I hope that we're not put in this position, but I think everybody hopes that they're not put in this position. But I think the math implies that at some point this season, we're going to see this happen again. And hopefully the people are a little more refined in how we handle it, and also that the policies are a little more clearly communicated and executed. So a big learning experience. Again, I don't think right?
I don't think sure. I agree with that 100%. I don't think the policies were incorrect. I mean, maybe they make updates because of Delta variant, or because there's a sense that that's what the ultimate membership wants, that they want to go above and beyond what is being set out by the CDC, which, it's a membership organization. They should listen to their members. If members want to see a more strict policy in place, then that's what they should do. But I don't think the policies themselves were in any way out of line or improperly executed on. I think they did exactly what they were supposed to do. And I think that, Public Enemy continuing to play in the tournament was totally acceptable. I think Public Enemy handled this totally fine as well.
I'm very impressed with how Public Enemy handled it, to be honest with you.
Yeah. But again, I mean, it feels like tone deaf to me to try to treat this situation, this COVID, we're unwilling to play because of this COVID situation, in the same way that you would treat a team trying to bail on the first round on Sunday because they want to drive home because they had a bad time on Saturday or something. It's not the same. And it doesn't need to be treated the same. And like threatening sanctions just doesn't make a lot of sense to me, given that it's not going to work. It didn't work, basically did not work. And it feels coercive.
Not a good look. That's got to be one of the moves that USA Ultimate is like, yeah, we got it. I wish we could take that back.
Yeah. All right. Well, let us know your thoughts. Hit us up at DeepLookPod on Twitter, deeplook@ultiworld.com. It's not like it's unjustifiable to, just to be clear, like, how much communication is the right amount of communication is actually a difficult question to answer. You're not going to go out and publish the name of the person who got COVID and like publish all their identifying details or something. But I think it has to be more than nothing, which is basically what it was. It was like the communication was only to the team. It feels like this is the MO. USAU constantly is like, they want to like keep communication to the absolute minimum. And then it always ends up causing problems because how are you not going to expect it to go, through the grapevine at the tournament? Of course it's going to. And then it did. And then there was misinformation floating around. And then, you're trying to put the genie back in the bottle. And same thing with the forfeit thing. It's like, okay, yes, there's a logical reason why you would want to make sure that teams continue to play the games, because you're saying this team is safe by our policies, which you agreed to by enrolling in this event. But it just feels tone deaf to the actual situation at hand, and particularly in this season where it literally doesn't matter what happens at this tournament. It just doesn't matter at all.
Not the place to make your stand, it feels like.
Let's turn our attention over to some picks in the AUDL as we get to the end of the regular season. Keith, we went 3 for 3 last week in our picks. We maintain our lead over stall 7. And we correctly picked Raleigh to beat Atlanta. That was a crazy one. LA +5 and Minnesota -3.5. That was also a crazy one. Minnesota getting a late cover thanks to Indy dropping the disc in the end zone for what would have been the score to cover the spread.
Bad beats for some folks online.
Brutal. Akshat, I'm sorry, my friend. I'm sorry. It's brutal. The Atlantic Division remains way up in the air, and we head into this weekend with basically every team still having a chance to host a home playoff game, depending on how these next couple weeks go. So exciting finish to the season coming up in the AUDL. And let's take a look. A bunch of teams clinched playoff spots, though. I mean, all the playoff teams are now locked in. It's going to be New York, DC, Atlanta, and Raleigh in the Atlantic. It's going to be Chicago, Minnesota in the Central, and it's going to be San Diego and Dallas in the West. Keith, let's get into this week's picks.
This is the question. Can we hold on to the lead? So let's start in Minnesota in the Central. Madison at Minnesota. Minnesota 2.5 point favorites.
This is brutal because neither team has anything to play for. So where do you go here? Do you feel like Minnesota is just going to rest? Are they going to try to stay sharp? Is Madison going to bring a full team? My lean is Minnesota -2.5.
I'm with you on that. I think that for them, they don't want to let the momentum get away from them. They're going to be dogs going into the postseason. And their bench has shown some capability as well,
sure,
but they certainly have things to iron out. Madison, I think, is probably a pretty prideful group, but I don't know. I don't know if I see a lot for them to show up here.
I think it's a road game too. If there's Madison players who have anything else to do, they got a barbecue to go to. They they want to just go sit outside in the park for a little bit, even just sitting on their porch. They're going to do that and not go to this game. I mean, so I think we could see a poor roster. I could be wrong, but the motivation's obviously not going to be there for Madison besides playing for pride. But I would be surprised if they sent a full strength team. Minnesota, on the other hand, is at home, so they're going to have their team, and they're probably going to be trying to get ready for the playoffs. So
I don't know.
Minnesota -2.5.
I picked this game. I'm with you on Minnesota -2.5. I picked this game, but maybe I should have picked can Detroit cover 7.5 against a Chicago team that at home against Chicago when Chicago has no reason to try and win that game. Maybe I should have picked that. Maybe this is a more interesting line.
I mean, I don't know. It's a very similar kind of spot. We've got Raleigh.
But Detroit has something to play for. They always have something to play for.
They certainly do. Raleigh at DC, and it's pick'em.
Feels familiar, huh? We're back here with Raleigh pick'em, huh? Only this time they're on the road, and I don't know that we have the same kind. I don't have the same kind of confidence that I had last week. And even then, I think we thought that was a pretty small margin. But, Raleigh had a lot to play for. They're at home. This one, I feel a lot less confident. I think I want to go with the road team or with the home team. These teams are probably on a pretty evenly matched. So pick'em feels like the right call in a neutral site. But there's not a lot to go on here for me besides saying let's take the home team. I think these teams are roughly about as good as one another. Is there some matchup piece that you see that I don't?
DC's played well historically against Raleigh. even in years when DC's like clearly the inferior team. They've played up and played tough against Raleigh. It feels to me like Raleigh has played better than DC as of late. I feel like it could be a real catalyzing moment for them to have got that comeback win against Atlanta. You know, you don't want to put too much stock in one game. I mean, DC, like, I don't know. I really lean towards Raleigh here, even though they're on the road, I have to say.
You really could put your faith in the team that couldn't win up 2 with 43 seconds left?
I know. I understand. But I feel like New York's a better team than DC. I don't know. This DC Breeze team is hard to get a read on sometimes. They've had some great moments this year. But like, let's look at their results from the last couple of weeks. Let's just take a quick look. Because I want to get a sense of like what their form is lately. So they got pretty comfortable, easy wins against Pittsburgh and Philly. But their last loss was to Atlanta, that 17-13 game where they didn't look very good. I don't know. I have no feel for this one. Pick'em feels like the right line, so I'm happy to defer to you on this one.
I'm with DC. I just don't see a lot of meaningful difference between these two teams, so I'm down with
the home team. All right, I take it. Last one.
We go out west. Things are pretty locked up here. So again, we're in week 12, so it's a little tricky. But we got San Jose visiting San Diego. Growlers -3.5 here.
I think you got to go Growlers. The line is too short. I feel like it should be 5.5. San Jose is just not that good.
You're not worried they're going to phone it in?
I mean, I'm definitely worried they're going to phone it in, but I think you have to hope that the teams that are going to the playoffs are actually more likely to play hard than the teams that are already out. Because they have a reason to try to stay sharp and like keep focused on the O-line and stuff. I'm trying to see, the Spiders are playing, it's their first game. It's the Friday night game.
Yeah. So
Spiders at Growlers in their first game of the weekend. I mean, again, I just think the number's off.
Here's my concern. I guess I could probably do the math on this real quick in my head, but so let's see, they're 3.5 point favorites, and the total is 38.5. It's tied for the lowest total. For some reason, these West Coast games like do not score. Nobody scores on the West Coast. What is that about?
The teams aren't that good.
Is that really what it is?
That's what I think.
Oh man, it's not good. So what? That's if you split it in half, it's 19.5. So, what's that, like a projected score of like 21-17? I think. Yeah, that sounds about right.
Yeah.
Does that feel like the right score for these two teams to you?
Well, let me just give you this data point. San Diego played at San Jose back in June, and they won 23-16. So what more do you need to know?
I mean, that's a lot. I'd also say that San Diego is 2-3 against the spread over the past 3 weeks.
Yeah, but why are they getting 5 points against LA, but only 3.5 points on the road, by the way, and 3.5 points against San Jose playing at home? The number just is wrong, Keith.
I do feel like they're probably more likely to cover this than to fall short. I just think like I'm with you here.
The likelihood of a team playing flat feels even on both sides to me.
That's true.
I think you take the home team here. We're already taking home teams, right?
Rolling with home teams.
Let's stay with the home teams.
If it ain't broke.
San Diego -3.5. I actually may end up making that one of my best bets this week. I just think the number's way too short. San Jose's not good, and they're like banged up.
All right, San Diego -3.5. So to recap, all the home teams were taking Minnesota as a 2.5 point favorite with Madison coming to town, DC in DC as a pick'em against Raleigh, and San Diego at home with San Jose coming, and it's a 3.5 point line.
All righty.
Home favorites. Obviously, that's been a recipe for success. They're only 5-15.
Thank you so much for tuning in. Appreciate you listening, and check out our subscriber bonus segment where we talk about semi-pro strategies. short pulls, clock management, end of quarter situations, and maybe things that teams aren't doing yet. So ultiworld.com/subscribe, and you can get access to that right in your podcast feed of choice. For Keith Raynor, I'm Charlie Eisenhood saying so long, and we'll talk to you next week right here on Deep Look.